"Sir, I'm going to ask you one last time to step out of the boarding lane." The young gate agent didn't raise her voice, but she didn't have to. Half the people waiting near gate 24 had already stopped looking at their phones. Nolan Barrett glanced at his daughter before answering. "I'm not refusing," he said calmly. "I'm asking if there's any way an 8-year-old can sit with her father." The agent sighed as if she'd heard the question 100 times already. "If you wanted guaranteed seats together, you should have paid for them." Charlie tightened her grip on the faded blue backpack hanging from her shoulders. She looked at her boarding pass, then at her dad. "But we booked together." "I know we did," Nolan said, kneeling beside her. "We'll figure it out." Boston Logan Airport buzzed with the familiar rhythm of rolling suitcases, coffee orders, and boarding announcements. Thanksgiving week always brought packed terminals, delayed flights, and tired employees trying to move thousands of travelers from one gate to another. Nolan understood pressure. Maybe more than most people. That was exactly why he hated making anyone's day harder. He stood, thanked the agent anyway, and stepped aside without another argument. Charlie frowned. "You didn't do anything wrong. That doesn't always change the outcome." It wasn't the answer she wanted, and he knew it. Nolan had spent the last 4 years raising Charlie alone after losing his wife to cancer. Since then, he tried to teach her something he was still learning himself, that dignity wasn't something other people handed you. It was something you decided not to give away. Still, there was a difference between staying calm and staying silent. And lately, Nolan wasn't sure he always knew where that line was. "Before the story goes any further, I'd love to know something about you. How old are you, where are you watching from, and have you ever been in a situation where someone judged you before they knew anything about you?" Charlie looked across the waiting area. A businessman wearing an expensive navy coat walked toward the counter. The same gate agent greeted him with a warm smile. "No problem at all, sir. Let me take care of that for you." Less than 30 seconds later, the man walked away carrying a new boarding pass. Charlie looked back at her own ticket. Why did he get help? Nolan followed her eyes. The question landed harder than she realized. Because children rarely asked about fairness to start an argument. They asked because they expected the world to make sense. "I don't know," he admitted. It wasn't completely true. He had a suspicion. He simply wasn't ready to say it out loud. Instead, he opened his backpack and pulled out a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in wax paper. Charlie smiled. "You remembered." "I always remember." They sat together near the window overlooking the runway. Snow flurries drifted across the gray afternoon sky while aircraft taxied through the cold. For Nolan, this trip wasn't supposed to be about airports. It was supposed to celebrate Charlie finishing her first soccer season without missing a single practice. He promised her one adventure before winter truly settled in. He had no intention of letting a seating problem ruin that promise. But as another family approached the counter and received the same dismissive treatment, Nolan quietly slipped his phone from his pocket. Not to record anyone. Not to expose anyone. Just to start paying closer attention. Because for the first time that afternoon, he wasn't wondering whether one employee had made a bad decision. He was beginning to wonder whether everyone was simply following the same invisible rules. Charlie kept watching the gate counter long after the businessman disappeared down the jet bridge. "Dad? Yeah? Did he know somebody?" Nolan smiled faintly. "Maybe. Do you think that's why they helped him?" "I don't know." She tilted her head, unconvinced. "You said that twice?" "I did. When you say I don't know, it usually means you're thinking." He laughed quietly. "You've gotten pretty good at reading me." Charlie shrugged. "You make the same face every time." For a moment, the tension eased. Nolan looked around the waiting area again, this time with a different purpose. Years ago, he would have brushed the encounter aside as one employee having a difficult day. Now he found himself paying attention to little details that most travelers ignored. The elderly couple sitting across from them looked confused. The husband struggled to hear the boarding announcements while his wife searched through a folder full of printed confirmations. When they finally reached the counter, The conversation lasted less than a minute. "I'm sorry," the gate agent said without looking up. "You'll have to step aside until we finish priority boarding." "But we don't understand," the woman began. "Next passenger." The couple quietly moved away. Neither complained. Neither argued. Charlie watched them with wide eyes. "They look like Grandpa and Grandma." Nolan nodded. "They do." A few minutes later, another family approached. A tired mother balanced a diaper bag on one shoulder while carrying a sleeping toddler in her arms. Her husband pulled 2 rolling suitcases behind him. Their stroller had been tagged incorrectly at security. Instead of offering help, another employee pointed them toward a customer service desk almost 2 terminals away. The mother stared in disbelief. "Our flight boards in 15 minutes. "I'm sorry, ma'am." "That's the procedure." Procedure. The word stayed with Nolan. Not because it sounded cruel. Because it sounded practiced. Charlie leaned closer. "Why doesn't anyone help?" "They probably think they are helping." "How?" "They're following instructions." She frowned. "But instructions can be wrong." Nolan looked at his daughter. "They can." The answer surprised even him. He had spent most of his career believing that good systems produced good outcomes. If enough smart people designed the right process, fairness would naturally follow. But sitting inside Terminal B, watching exhausted families bounce from one employee to another, fairness felt strangely absent. A loudspeaker announced another boarding group. People instinctively stood, forming a crooked line that stretched halfway across the seating area. Nolan remained seated. Charlie noticed. "Aren't we supposed to get in line?" "We have time." "You always wait." "I like seeing how things work before I jump in." That was true. It was also something he'd taught himself after becoming a single father. When life changed overnight, rushing usually made things worse. Observing first often revealed something everyone else missed. Charlie unwrapped the last bite of her sandwich. "You know what Mom would have done?" Nolan smiled before she even answered. "She would have started talking to everybody." Charlie laughed. "And she'd probably know everyone's name before we got on the plane." "That sounds exactly like her." The memory settled gently between them instead of hurting. Some days grief still arrived like a wave. Other days it simply sat beside them, quiet enough to let life continue. A sudden commotion near the boarding lane interrupted the moment. A college student wearing worn-out work boots was being questioned about the size of his carry-on backpack. "It's the same backpack I flew with last month," he explained. "The sizing policy has changed. I checked your website yesterday." "I'm sorry, sir." The student looked around helplessly before pulling out a credit card. "I guess I don't have a choice," Charlie whispered. "That doesn't seem fair either." "No," Nolan replied softly. "It doesn't." He slipped his phone into his hand. Not to film faces. Not to catch someone making a mistake. Instead, he opened the airline's customer feedback app. He searched for one specific category: gate service complaints. Thousands of comments appeared. Most travelers would have closed the app after seeing the long list. Nolan kept scrolling. Different airports. Different employees. Different cities. Yet the stories echoed one another with uncomfortable consistency. Ignored. Dismissed. Separated from family. Treated differently because of appearance. His jaw tightened. This wasn't beginning to look like coincidence. It looked like a pattern. For the first time that afternoon, Nolan stopped wondering whether he was watching ordinary travel frustrations. Instead, a far more unsettling thought crossed his mind. If complete strangers were experiencing the same thing over and over again, then somewhere, someone had unknowingly built a system that allowed it to happen. Boarding Group 3 was called, and the waiting area stirred like a wave. People stood. Zipped jackets, gathered children, folded newspapers, and instinctively moved toward the boarding lane. Nolan and Charlie joined the line without saying much. Charlie still held her boarding pass with both hands, glancing every few seconds to make sure her father's ticket was still in his pocket. "You nervous?" Nolan asked. A little. About flying? She shook her head. I'm scared we'll end up sitting apart. Nolan rested a hand on her shoulder. If that happens, we'll figure it out together. She nodded, though her expression didn't change. As they reached the boarding scanner, Vivian Cross looked up from her screen. Recognition flickered across her face, not because she knew Nolan, but because she remembered the man who had questioned the seating assignment earlier. Boarding passes, please. Nolan handed them over. Vivian scanned Charlie's first. A sharp beep echoed from the scanner. She frowned. One moment. Her fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. Another employee walked over. They whispered for several seconds while passengers behind Nolan shifted impatiently. Finally, Vivian looked back up. I'm sorry, sir. There's been a last-minute update. Nolan remained calm. What kind of update? Your daughter's seat has been reassigned. Charlie looked confused. But why? Vivian avoided her eyes. We needed to accommodate another passenger. Nolan took a slow breath. Can you at least tell me where she'll be sitting? 22A. And mine? 34C. Charlie looked up at her father. Dad? He squeezed her hand. No 8-year-old should sit alone on a full flight. Vivian's voice stayed professional. Those are the available assignments. Nolan noticed several empty premium seats through the boarding door. I'm not asking for an upgrade. I'm asking for my daughter to stay with her parent. The computer determines seating. The computer doesn't make every decision. The passengers behind them grew restless. Someone muttered, "Come on." Another sighed dramatically. Vivian glanced at the growing line. Sir, if you continue delaying boarding, I'll have to ask you to step aside. Charlie lowered her head. Nolan looked at her before answering. We'll step aside. He refused to let his daughter become the center of an argument. As they moved away from the scanner, Charlie quietly asked, Are we getting kicked off the plane? No. Are you mad? I'm disappointed. At her? Nolan looked toward the boarding desk. No. Then who? He didn't answer. Because for the first time that afternoon, he wasn't sure. Was it the employee? The policy? Or the people who designed the policy? Vivian continued boarding passengers. Her movements were efficient, confident, almost automatic. She wasn't smiling anymore. Neither was she being intentionally cruel. She simply acted like someone following a process she trusted. Nolan couldn't stop thinking about that. A supervisor hurried over carrying a company tablet. She spoke quietly to Vivian while pointing toward the gate display overhead. Vivian's expression changed. Not fear. Confusion. She looked back at Nolan, then at the screen, then back to the tablet again. Several nearby employees stopped what they were doing. One by one, their eyes lifted toward the large digital display hanging above the boarding lane. The airline logo faded. A new message appeared. Welcome, Mr. Nolan Barrett. Board Chairman, thank you for joining us for the 25th Anniversary Leadership Summit. For one long heartbeat, the terminal became strangely quiet. Passengers looked from the screen to the man standing beside the little girl with the faded blue backpack. A businessman who had boarded moments earlier stepped back into the jet bridge entrance, staring in disbelief. The elderly couple exchanged puzzled glances. Even Charlie blinked at the screen before turning toward her father. Dad? Nolan closed his eyes for the briefest moment. He had completely forgotten that the corporate events team scheduled automatic welcome messages for executive travel. He had never asked for them. In fact, he disliked them. Vivian's face lost all color. I'm so sorry, Mr. Barrett. Nolan opened his eyes and spoke with the same calm voice he had used all afternoon. Please don't stop boarding. She stared at him, unable to move. The passengers shouldn't be delayed because of me. No anger. No raised voice. No public humiliation. Only a quiet request that seemed to leave the entire gate even more unsettled than any outburst ever could. As the boarding lines slowly began moving again, Nolan looked once more at the family still waiting to board. The screen had revealed who he was. But it hadn't answered the question that now mattered most. How many people had walked away from gates like this believing they simply weren't important enough to deserve better? The rest of the boarding process unfolded in complete silence. No one looked at Nolan the same way anymore. The gate agents suddenly offered to move Charlie's seat beside her father. A flight attendant hurried down the jet bridge, apologizing before they had even stepped onto the aircraft. Nolan accepted the new boarding passes. He did not accept the apologies. Not because he wanted revenge. Because he wasn't yet sure what they were apologizing for. As they settled into their row, Charlie leaned against the window and watched the baggage crews work beneath the falling snow. "Dad? I'm here. Were they nice because of the screen?" He looked out the window before answering. "I think they were surprised. Would they have helped us if your name hadn't been up there?" The question lingered between them long after the cabin door closed. "I honestly don't know," he admitted. Charlie nodded slowly. "I wish they would've." "So do I." The aircraft pushed back from the gate, and soon Boston disappeared beneath a blanket of gray clouds. Most passengers settled into movies, books, or sleep. Nolan opened his laptop instead. Not to answer emails. Not to prepare for the leadership summit waiting for him after landing. He opened the airline's internal reporting portal. The first report he searched wasn't about delays, profits, or fuel costs. It was customer complaints involving gate service. Hundreds appeared. Then thousands. He narrowed the search. Families seated apart. Passengers needing assistance. Complaints mentioning disrespect. The number barely changed. He kept reading. Different airports. Different supervisors. Different employees. Yet the language felt strangely familiar. They looked at me and decided I wasn't worth helping. I was told to step aside without explanation. They treated the man in the suit differently. One story after another. One airport after another. Charlie had fallen asleep beside him, her head resting against his shoulder. Nolan gently pulled a blanket over her. Then he looked back at the screen. For years, he had measured the airline by on-time departures, safety records, operational efficiency, and financial performance. Every quarterly report told him the company was improving. Every investor presentation celebrated another successful year. But none of those charts showed the quiet moments that shaped how people remembered a journey. No graph measured the embarrassment of being dismissed in front of a child. No performance dashboard tracked the look on Charlie's face when she thought she might have to fly alone. The realization settled heavily. This wasn't a story about one gate agent making a poor decision. If the same complaints appeared across cities, shifts, and teams, then the problem had survived countless managers, training sessions, and policy updates. That meant something far more uncomfortable. The system itself was teaching decent people to make the wrong choice. And somewhere along the way, he had signed off on the very system that now sat open on his laptop. The leadership summit began less than 2 hours after Nolan's plane landed. Executives filled the conference room overlooking the airport. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed aircraft taxiing across the wet runway while presentations cycled through charts showing record customer growth, stronger profits, and the best on-time performance in nearly a decade. Everyone looked pleased. Everyone except Nolan. He barely glanced at the slides. Instead, he kept seeing Charlie's face when she had asked one simple question. Would they have helped us if your name hadn't been on that screen? He still didn't have an answer. As the meeting moved into operational updates, the chief operating officer smiled confidently. Our customer satisfaction scores remain among the highest in the industry. Several board members nodded. Nolan closed his laptop. How do we calculate those scores? The room became noticeably quieter. The CEO looked surprised. We use post-flight surveys, loyalty member feedback, and quarterly market research. What percentage of passengers actually complete those surveys? Roughly 12%. And the other 88%? They're statistically represented. Nolan didn't respond immediately. He reached into his briefcase and placed a printed stack of papers in the center of the conference table. I spent the flight reading these. The pages spread across polished wood. Customer complaints. Gate reports. Internal reviews. Most had never reached the board. Some had been closed automatically after receiving template responses. Others had simply been categorized as isolated incidents. How many people in this room have read these? Nolan asked. No one answered. Finally, the vice president of customer experience cleared her throat. Individual complaints are handled by regional management. Nolan nodded slowly. That's exactly what concerns me. He stood and walked toward the large display screen. I don't believe this is a regional problem anymore. He projected a map of the United States. Small red markers appeared across dozens of airports. Boston, Denver, Phoenix, Atlanta, Dallas, Seattle, Chicago. The room stared silently. These aren't duplicate reports, Nolan said. These are different families describing almost identical experiences. He clicked again. Another chart appeared. Passengers separated from children. Elderly travelers left without assistance. Wheelchair requests delayed. Families told policies couldn't be changed, only to watch exceptions made for someone else minutes later. No names. Just patterns. Our numbers tell us we're efficient, Nolan continued. They don't tell us whether people feel respected. One director folded his arms. With respect, Nolan, every airline receives complaints. I know. Then what exactly are you suggesting? I'm suggesting we've been measuring the wrong things. A few people exchanged uneasy glances. The chief financial officer leaned forward. If this becomes public, we'll create a media storm over problems most customers never experience. Nolan looked directly at him. How do you know they never experienced them? The data, no. He interrupted gently. The data tells us who answered our questions. It doesn't tell us who stopped believing we'd listen. Silence settled over the room again. Then someone spoke from the far end of the table. What happened in Boston? Nolan hadn't mentioned Boston. Not once. Yet everyone knew something had changed. He considered giving the simple version. A gate agent. A seating issue. An automatic welcome screen. Instead, he chose honesty. My daughter asked me whether kindness depends on who people think you are. No one moved. I realized I couldn't answer her. The room remained still. Not because Nolan owned the company. Not because he chaired the board. But because every parent in the room understood exactly what he meant. He looked around the table one last time. I'm not interested in finding someone to blame. I'm interested in finding the decisions that taught good employees to stop seeing people. The words landed harder than any accusation could have. Because they shifted responsibility away from one gate agent, and placed it squarely on the people sitting around that table, including Nolan himself. The meeting ended without a vote. No one argued. No one applauded. The board members simply gathered their folders and left the room more quietly than they had entered it. Nolan remained seated. The runway outside had disappeared behind heavy snow, and aircraft lights blinked through the gray afternoon like distant stars. His phone buzzed. It was Charlie. How's your meeting? He smiled. Still working. Have you eaten? A few seconds later she replied with a picture of a grilled cheese sandwich, a cup of tomato soup, and a smile that seemed much bigger than the meal itself. Aunt Megan says it's the best soup in Boston. Nolan laughed softly. Tell Aunt Megan I'm jealous. The smile faded as another notification appeared. Vivian Cross had requested a meeting. Not with Human Resources. Not with the legal department. With him. Personally. Most executives would have declined. Nolan accepted. An hour later, Vivian stepped into a small conference room overlooking one of the maintenance hangars. She looked nothing like the confident manager from Gate 24. She looked exhausted. Thank you for seeing me. Nolan gestured toward the chair across from him. You don't have to stand. She sat carefully, placing a thick binder on the table. I know everyone assumes I'm here to apologize. Aren't you? I am. She paused. But that's not why I asked to meet. She slid the binder toward him. Inside were printed training manuals, performance scorecards, internal emails, and handwritten notes. Some pages were highlighted. Others were covered with sticky notes. I've worked for this airline for 11 years. Nolan opened the first section without speaking. The first few years were different. Vivian continued. We were told to solve problems. She turned another page. Then the metrics changed. Nolan read silently. Average boarding time. Premium customer retention. Ancillary revenue. Escalation rate. Every supervisor's bonus depended on those numbers. Vivian pointed to one paragraph buried halfway down the page. Avoid exceptions that interrupt boarding flow unless operationally necessary. She gave a tired smile. Nobody ever said, judge people by how they look. They didn't have to. Nolan looked up. She nodded. You start learning which passengers are likely to complain. Which ones belong to loyalty programs. Which ones buy premium tickets. And eventually, her voice cracked, you begin making assumptions before anyone even speaks. The room fell silent. Either of them liked what that meant. Vivian reached into the binder again. I started collecting these about 2 years ago. She pulled out anonymous employee surveys. One after another. We're rewarded for speed. We don't have enough authority to solve problems. We avoid unusual situations because delays hurt our evaluations. We're afraid to make exceptions. Nolan slowly turned each page. None of them described cruel employees. They described frightened employees. People trying to protect their jobs by following measurements that quietly pushed compassion further down the priority list. He leaned back in his chair. I approve these scorecards. Vivian looked at him. No. I never read them this way. I don't think anyone did. That answer somehow hurt more. Because it wasn't built on malice. It was built on neglect. The kind that grows quietly over years until it becomes normal. Vivian took a deep breath. I'll accept whatever happens to me. I made my own decisions at that gate. I'm responsible for that. She hesitated before adding, but if you replace me tomorrow without changing this. She gently tapped the binder. Someone else will eventually stand where I stood. Nolan closed the folder. For the first time since Boston, he felt the shape of the real problem. It wasn't hidden inside one airport. It wasn't hidden inside one employee. It was hidden inside thousands of ordinary decisions, repeated so often that they no longer felt like decisions at all. Changing one person would be easy. Changing the system that had quietly trained them to stop seeing people. That would cost far more than money. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for 8 o'clock the next morning. No reporters were invited. No press release had been drafted. Every board member had received the same package the night before: customer complaints, employee surveys, performance scorecards, and one handwritten note from Nolan. If we only discuss reputation today, we're discussing the wrong problem. The room filled quietly. Some directors looked tired. Others looked defensive. Everyone understood this meeting would end differently than it began. Nolan waited until the doors closed before speaking. I appreciate everyone coming on short notice. No one interrupted. He stood beside the large screen, but this time there were no colorful graphs celebrating growth. Instead, one sentence appeared in plain black letters. What are we rewarding? He let the question hang in the room. Our airline is operating safely. Another click. Our flights leave on time. Another click. We've exceeded financial expectations. A final click. So why are families telling us they feel invisible? Silence answered him. The chief financial officer leaned forward. Nobody is denying there are problems. But we have to be realistic. If we publicly announce a company-wide review, investors will assume something much worse is happening. Another director agreed. The headlines alone could damage bookings for months. Someone else added, we should handle this internally. Nolan listened without interrupting. When the room finally became quiet again, he folded his hands. I understand every concern you've raised. I've had the same thoughts. He looked toward the windows overlooking the runway. For years, I believed protecting this company meant protecting its image. He turned back. I don't believe that anymore. The words surprised even some of the people who had worked beside him for years. The image doesn't create trust. Our choices do. One board member shook his head. You're asking us to volunteer for criticism. No. Nolan answered calmly. I'm asking us to stop pretending criticism doesn't already exist. He picked up the binder Vivian had given him. I met with the gate manager from Boston yesterday. A few people exchanged uneasy glances. I expected excuses. I found something else. He opened the binder. I found employees trying to succeed under measurements that slowly taught them to stop solving human problems. No one spoke. They weren't rewarded for compassion. They were rewarded for speed. They weren't encouraged to make thoughtful decisions. They were encouraged to avoid delays. He paused. And we designed those measurements. The sentence landed heavily. Not because it accused anyone. Because no one could honestly deny it. The chairman emeritus, a man who had served on the board for nearly 20 years, finally broke the silence. What exactly are you proposing? Nolan didn't hesitate. I want an independent review of every customer service performance metric. I want every incentive tied to gate operations re-examined. I want frontline employees included in that review. And I want the final report released exactly as it's written. Several directors looked stunned. You'd publish our own mistakes? If they're real. The CFO frowned. That could cost us millions. It might. It could even cost me this job. The room fell silent again. Nolan thought about Charlie. About the way she looked at him in Boston. About the quiet disappointment in her voice when she'd asked whether kindness depended on a person's name. If he walked away from this meeting protecting quarterly numbers instead of confronting the truth, he'd eventually have to answer that question. Not as a chairman. As a father. He took a slow breath. I can't promise this decision will make us more profitable next quarter. I can't promise the headlines will be kind. But I can promise something else. If we ignore what we've learned simply because telling the truth is expensive, then every apology we offer our passengers from this day forward will be nothing more than a carefully written script. No one argued after that. Not because everyone agreed, but because, for the first time, the conversation was no longer about saving a company. It was about deciding what kind of company deserved to be saved. 3 weeks later, the first draft of the independent review landed on Nolan Barrett's desk. He read every page himself. No assistant summarized it. No executive filtered it. No lawyer softened the language. The report was difficult to read because it wasn't written to protect anyone. It described an airline that had become exceptionally good at measuring efficiency while slowly losing sight of the people those measurements were supposed to serve. No one had ordered employees to discriminate. No one had created a policy that said families should be separated whenever possible. No one had instructed gate agents to judge passengers by their appearance. The system had done something more subtle. It rewarded speed over conversation, consistency over judgment, predictability over compassion. Little by little, decent employees learned which decisions protected their performance reviews. After reading the final page, Nolan closed the report and stared out his office window. The hardest part wasn't discovering what had gone wrong. It was accepting that so much of it had happened while he believed everything was working. That afternoon, the board met once again. This time, there were no arguments about whether a problem existed. The debate centered on what they were willing to sacrifice to fix it. The chief financial officer spoke first. If we remove these performance targets immediately, boarding times will increase. They probably will. Our operating costs will rise. They probably will. We'll disappoint investors. Nolan nodded. Probably. The room waited for him to continue. But none of those costs are larger than teaching another child that respect depends on how expensive someone looks. No one challenged him. Not because the statement was emotional, Because everyone around the table had now read the same evidence. The board voted. Not unanimously, but decisively. The airline would redesign every frontline performance evaluation. Gate agents would no longer be judged primarily by boarding speed alone. Managers would receive authority to solve family seating issues without requesting multiple approvals. Employee evaluations would include documented customer resolutions instead of simply counting how quickly boarding ended. Anonymous frontline feedback would be reviewed directly by an independent committee rather than disappearing into regional management. The decisions sounded procedural. On paper, they looked almost ordinary. Yet everyone in the room understood they represented something much larger. For years, employees had adapted themselves to fit the system. Now the system would finally be required to serve both employees and passengers. Later that evening, Nolan asked Vivian Cross to stop by his office. She entered quietly, carrying the same notebook she had brought to every meeting since Boston. "I heard the vote passed." "It did." She smiled with visible relief. "I wasn't sure it would." "Neither was I." She hesitated before speaking again. "I've spent the last few weeks expecting to lose my job." "I know." "And?" Nolan looked at her for a long moment. "You made mistakes." "I did." "You also chose to tell the truth when it would have been easier to protect yourself." Vivian lowered her eyes. "I almost didn't." "But you did." He slid a folder across the desk. Inside wasn't a promotion. It wasn't a bonus. It wasn't a letter of forgiveness. It was an invitation. A temporary assignment on the team. Responsible for rewriting the airline's frontline operating standards. Vivian looked up in surprise. "You still trust me?" Nolan answered carefully. "I trust people who are willing to admit when they've been wrong and help make sure the same mistake isn't repeated." She swallowed hard. "I don't deserve this. This isn't a reward." He shook his head gently. "It's a responsibility." For the first time since the incident in Boston, Vivian allowed herself to breathe. Not because everything had been fixed. Far from it. The difficult work had only begun. As she stood to leave, Nolan stopped her. "One more thing." She turned. "When we rewrite those standards, don't write them for board members. Don't write them for investors. Write them for the father who's trying to keep his little girl beside him." Vivian smiled through tear-filled eyes. "I know exactly which father you mean." Nolan smiled back. "I hope one day no one else will have to." Outside his office, airplanes continued arriving and departing as they always had. Most passengers would never know a series of meetings had changed anything. And that was perfectly fine with Nolan. Real leadership wasn't measured by how many people knew your name. Sometimes it was measured by how many strangers never had to experience the same quiet humiliation again. 6 months later, Nolan and Charlie found themselves standing in another boarding line. Not because they wanted to revisit what had happened in Boston. Life had simply moved forward. Charlie had finished another soccer season. Nolan had kept his promise to never let work steal the moments that mattered most. They were heading west for a weekend with Charlie's cousins, carrying the same faded blue backpack that had traveled with them before. "Dad," Charlie said with a grin, "you still haven't bought a new backpack." He looked down and laughed. "It still works. I think it's kind of famous now. Only to you? And Aunt Megan. That's a very exclusive fan club." Charlie laughed as they joined the line. This time, something caught Nolan's attention almost immediately. A young mother approached the counter carrying a sleeping toddler while trying to calm another little boy who looked ready to cry. Her boarding pass showed that she and her children had been separated. Before she could even ask for help, the gate agent smiled. "Let's see what we can do." The employee typed for a few moments, made 2 quick phone calls, then handed back 3 new boarding passes. "There you go. You'll all be together." The mother blinked in surprise. "That's it. That's it. Thank you." "No problem at all. Have a wonderful flight." The entire conversation lasted less than 2 minutes. No embarrassment. No raised voices. No one asked how much she had paid. No one looked at her clothes. No one treated her like she was interrupting their day. Charlie watched quietly until the family walked away. Then she looked at her father. That feels different. It does. Do you think they know who you are? Nolan smiled. I hope not. Why? Because if they only helped because they recognized me, then we didn't really change anything. Charlie nodded thoughtfully. I think they were just helping. I think so too. For the first time since Boston, Nolan felt something inside him settle. Not pride. Not relief. Something quieter. Hope. The boarding process continued. An elderly couple received assistance with their carry-on bags. A college student was patiently shown how to avoid an unnecessary baggage fee by moving a few items into a personal bag instead of being charged without explanation. A passenger using a wheelchair was greeted by name before anyone asked for identification. Small moments. Ordinary moments. The kind that would never make the evening news. Yet those moments were changing the experience of hundreds of strangers every single day. As Nolan and Charlie reached the scanner, the gate agent smiled warmly. Good afternoon. She scanned their boarding passes. Looks like you're all set. Charlie looked up. We're sitting together, right? The agent checked once more. Row 14. 2 seats together. Charlie gave her father a quick high five. Mission accomplished. No special treatment. No announcement. No executive welcome message. No one recognized the chairman standing in line. And that was exactly how Nolan wanted it. As father and daughter walked down the jet bridge, Charlie slipped her hand into his. You know what I learned? What's that? Being important isn't about having your picture on a screen. Nolan smiled. What is it about? It's about making sure people don't have to feel small. He looked at his daughter with quiet admiration. Some lessons couldn't be taught with speeches. They had to be lived. Watching them disappear into the aircraft, I couldn't help thinking about how easily we judge one another in everyday life. Sometimes it's an old backpack, worn-out shoes, a tired face after a long day, or a simple economy class ticket that leads us to make assumptions. We often mistake appearance for character, income for worth, or status for dignity. But every person standing in an airport line is carrying a story we cannot see. Some are grieving. Some are working 2 jobs. Some are traveling to welcome a new baby. Others are saying goodbye to someone they love. Whether a person is wealthy or struggling financially, they deserve the same basic respect, patience, and kindness. Money can change a bank account, but it should never determine how much courtesy or humanity someone receives. Nolan never changed the airline by proving he was powerful. He changed it by accepting responsibility for a system that had forgotten the value of ordinary people. And perhaps that is the real ending of this story. Not that a poor-looking father turned out to own an airline, but that one little girl grew up seeing her father prove something far more valuable, that respect should never depend on a person's clothes, job, wealth, or social status. Because dignity is not something people earn after others discover who they are. It belongs to every human being from the very beginning.